So let's talk about making presentations. I think it's very important when you decide to make a presentation to give it a good structure, because that will help you when you're actually giving it. So let's look at some of the language which will help you give the presentation structure, okay? And let's call on the screen to help us with that. First, it's important to draw everybody's attention to make sure people are quiet. So you could say, for example, shall we start? Shall we begin? Or let's get started. All right, now those are ways to draw the attention of the audience. Then you need to greet them. So you could say, for example, good morning everyone, which is quite informal, good morning everyone. More formal would be, good morning ladies and gentlemen. That's more formal. So you greet them. Then you introduce yourself. So it would be like this. An example would be, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce myself. My name is Louise Evans, and I'm in charge of marketing. Okay, so you give your name and also your position of responsibility in the company. So you can say, I'm in charge of, or I'm responsible for marketing. Then you need to introduce the topic of your presentation. So you could say, the aim or the purpose, watch the pronunciation, the aim or the purpose or the objective of my presentation today is to talk about the marketing strategy. So 3 words, aim, objective, or purpose. Good. You could also say, for example, I'd like to give you a brief overview or an outline. Now that's quite similar to summary. It means a general picture. So I'd like to give you an overview or an outline of our marketing strategy. Then you need to usually divide the presentation up into 3 or 4 or 5 points. So we could say, I'll divide my presentation up into 4. Notice we say, I'll divide my presentation up into. It's quite complicated, that. I'll divide my presentation up into 4 points. Now, another word for points is items, or we could say headings, areas, sections, or subjects. Please don't say arguments, because an argument means a heated conversation between 2 people. So, I'll divide my presentation up into 4 main points, items, headings, areas, sections, or subjects. Then you need to look at the verbs that you can use, because you can say then, firstly, I'd like to discuss the marketing strategy. I'd like to introduce the marketing strategy. I'd like to look at is the same as analyze or consider. I'd like to explain, that means talk about the details so that people understand. I'd like to examine, I'd like to show, and I'd like to illustrate. These are the main verbs that you would use when describing what you're going to do. So firstly, you can say firstly, secondly, and finally, or last of all. So you see, you divide it up into sections. Firstly, secondly, finally, last of all. Now, it's often a good idea to talk about the duration, the length of your presentation, because often business presentations can be too long and boring. And if you say, for example, my presentation shouldn't take longer than 30 minutes, people are psychologically prepared and feel happier that they're not going to have to sit through a whole load of slides on a long explanation. Give them a time reference. Then, you need to decide when you're giving your presentation if you want people to interrupt you during it or if they should ask questions at the end of your presentation. Now, if you want to invite participation during the presentation, you could say, for example, please feel free to interrupt if anything's not clear. Okay? Please feel free to interrupt if anything's not clear, if you want to ask questions. Now, sometimes in a shorter presentation you would prefer to take questions at the end of the presentation, so you could say something like this. If you have any questions, could I ask you to keep them until the end of the presentation? Let's look at that again, it's not easy. If you have any questions, could I ask you to keep them until the end of the presentation, when I'll be very happy to answer them. All right? So there you keep control of how much interruption you have in your presentation. So we've said, firstly, I'd like to discuss, or I'd like to talk about the marketing strategy. Now, when you want to move on to the second point, you can say in English, good, now let's move on to my next point. Move on to my next point. Another possibility is, good, that brings me to my next point. So that's moving the presentation forward. If somebody interrupts you and you don't want to handle the interruption at that moment, you can say, yes, that's a very good question, but can I come back to that later? So recognize the question and say, that's a good question, to show that you're going to deal with it, but then say, can I come back to that later? And of course, if you say that, make sure you remember that question, make a mental note, and always answer it. Then, to conclude the presentation, you can say, I'd like to finish by saying that, or I'd like to conclude by saying that. Or you can say, in conclusion, I think we should, in conclusion. And the very last things to say are usually, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for it. Your attention is not necessary because you're doing the work. They're there to listen to you. So it's just better, I think, to say, that's it, which means it's finished. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, or thank you very much. All right? So I hope that helps you with your future presentations. Remember, structure is very important and it will help you remember things more clearly. So good luck with any presentation that you do in the future, and good luck in general with your business English. Bye.